Good evening, good evening, good evening, good evening, and good evening to you, ladies and gentlemen. This is WeatherBrains, episode number 811. This is for August 2nd, 2021. Had a weird little note. We do the same thing every week to set this thing up. And when something changes, you go, ooh. It was a little warning saying this is being live streamed. Like, duh, well, that's what I'm trying to set up here. But anyway, welcome. This is the pre-show, that magical, marvelous time of the program where we do three things. We share boring personal stories, humorous anecdotes, and we say outrageous things. We're back on Monday. We're back on regular schedule here. So thank you for letting us or me have a week off. I think Bill Murray was off last week too. So we recorded 2 episodes a couple of weeks ago, and that enabled us to have a little break, and we are thankful for that. And we're here. I'm strapped in now. And for those that don't know, I've been taking the same vacation schedule for years and years. I take a week in mid to late June, a week in either late July or early August, and a week at Christmas. I'm a pretty simple guy. I'm just a simpleton. So my next week off will be the week of Christmas. So I am strapped in, ready for the fall and all the good stuff that happens with that. It gets busy. I try and, ramp it down a little bit in the summertime because typically, every year I'm in schools, 1 or 2 a day. And that's, you get up at 4 a.m. and you get home at midnight and you get a little tired. But again, I absolutely love what I do. I would never, ever, ever gripe about it. But it tends to get a little busier when the school session kicks back in, and hopefully we'll be back in the school buildings this year. This Delta variant and other things are coming along, and the schools are having to make some decisions on, what they're going to do. And I'll know here in the next couple of weeks, I guess, if all these scheduled school programs will be in person, which will be really nice, or on a Zoom call. And of course, every single one that we did last year was on a Zoom call. And you could just see in those kids' eyes, I could just see it. Those guys are thinking, oh, great, another Zoom call. Let me stick some needles in my eyes. So, all right, let's get everybody invited here. Let's get this thing started. But anyway, I had a good week off. I did as little as possible. The first week off back in late June, we traveled a bit. And that in itself can be tiring. We had a great time. But this time, I just didn't do much of anything. I mean, I tried to do nothing, which is hard for me to do. You still got to manage social media. That stuff never goes away. I mean, you just can't put that down. But we went to dinner one night. Me and my wife went out with an old friend. We went to a movie one night. I've not been to a movie in probably 2 years. We went to like a, $5.15 cheapo special. And so we haven't done a movie in such a long time, but that was good. Drove down to a barbecue joint one night, and that was really good. We did go to a baseball game. We are not able to go to a random site this year like we typically do. So we went to the, which I guess for me is random. We went to the Truist Park in Atlanta. Bill, you ever been to that park in Atlanta?
No, and I still got to go. That's one I've got to knock off my list.
It was good. It was kind of odd, but we sat on row 1 in center field, which is one of our favorite places to sit. And it was good. I mean, we met a lot of people. It's close. So I posted a picture on social media of me with my feet propped up, my bad tennis shoes, and a lot of people came over to say hi, and that was great. Bill Clark, the UAB football coach, was there, and his wife sent a note, "Hey, we're here too." But anyway, we had a good time. The odd thing about the Atlanta experience, they had a roach infestation. I mean, I've never seen one
at the stadium.
Yes,
or just in the whole city.
There were roaches like everywhere out there. We were sitting. We're thinking, you squish one, 5 more come out of these cracks, and I'm thinking, what is the deal with this?
Even the roaches like the Braves, man. You can't beat that.
Gosh.
Yeah, now they're mating all the roaches to have bad looking calves. Did you hear that, James? And so the other roaches won't think they're attractive and they won't mate.
Well, they are mating big time at that stadium. So this guy Swanson hits a home run out there.
Darby.
And yeah, and you know, you don't expect, you know, a home run ball even where we were, but I mean that thing was coming right at us.
Did you catch it?
And it tailed off at the end and went about 5 seats more toward left field. So no, we didn't. I was ready. I mean,
you know what was missing, James?
What?
Otis Nixon in center field to just run up that wall, catch that ball.
That's true.
And Jen has no idea what we're talking about.
Lorenzo. What's Lorenzo? Lorenzo
Kane.
Yes.
Oh, very good, Dr.
James
Martin. Wow.
I like that. Boy, that's good.
Dansby's first home run was the 2-run homer that put him up 3-1 after he should have struck out on pitch number 6 in that at bat, as you well know.
I didn't notice that. Yeah,
he came back with a slam. Though, did you almost get the slam? Is that the one you're talking about?
No, we the first one. We were out in center field. Row 1. And we were 5 seats away from it. But a kid caught it. When I'm glad, you know, and if we would have caught, our youngest son is now 23.
Yeah.
So if we would have gotten the ball, we would have given it to some kid. I mean, you know, you're not going to do that. But anyway, it was Lorenzo, that guy, he's a good athlete.
He's a outfielder.
Very, very. He's had a great career, and I think he sat out much of last year. He didn't want to play with COVID, but he looked really strong out there. He's got great speed, great athleticism. Jackie Bradley Jr., we know him, but he didn't play. JBJ played for the Red Sox, and we met him through some friends that play for the Red Sox. Jackie and Aaron, they're a great family, just great people.
I bet.
And
he seems like a good guy. Struggled at the plate, but boy, is that guy an outfielder. He was just
he's always been inconsistent. He'll have these years where he bats 150 or 160, you know, and it's like, what do you do?
29 game hitting streak. Yeah.
It's just, you know, baseball, it's this crawl up in your head kind of thing.
Absolutely. Simone Biles squared. Yeah, that's what it is.
Exactly.
Ooh, welcome to Baseball Brains.
Yeah, welcome to Baseball Brains
podcast. It's all about baseball.
Hi guys, I've missed you all.
Aubrey is just like my heart is jumping for joy. You're back.
Oh,
yay!
You never say that about me.
Well, no, that's because I follow her pictures and everything, and you know, see what she's doing, and it's just like I think, goodness, we haven't had her in 2-3 weeks. I mean, this has been sad. So, welcome back.
Yeah,
thank you. It's good to be back.
So Jen, I went out and fed my cat a few minutes ago.
Good. I'm glad to hear. I think mine might be hungry right now. She's gonna have.
In fact, we stopped at a gas station coming out of Atlanta after that game Saturday night, and there was one little calico cat sitting out there in the parking lot. So, you know, I've always got cat food in my trucks. So I fed it. Immediately, 3 more came out of nowhere. So I had 4 cats.
Atlanta, cats and roaches.
Yeah. So I went from the roach infestation at the stadium to the cats, and those cats are working a scam operation. They all look very well fed. You know, all right, let's get this thing started. We're late here. Sorry. We're talking baseball and cats and roaches. All right, here we go. That'd be a great show title: Baseball, Cats, and Roaches. Here we go in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
You're listening to WeatherBrains. They're kind of a big deal.
Yes, our home smells of rich mahogany, and we have many leather-bound books. WeatherBrains number 811 is on the air. This is for August 2nd, 2021. And for those that missed it a few weeks ago, that really is Bill Curtis, the voice of the Anchorman movies, doing a liner for WeatherBrains. You know you've hit the big time, Aubrey, when you got Bill Curtis doing a liner for your show.
How do we get Bill Curtis?
Thanks to
just ask Jen.
Wow.
Jen knows everybody.
I must have missed. It was one of the episodes I was not on, but
I mean,
well done.
This is great, though.
I mean, this is just too cool.
You're listening to WeatherBrains. They're kind of a big deal.
That's awesome. Now I hear it. I didn't hear it a second ago.
Yeah, no, that is the, and what's so odd, Bill had such an amazing career as a journalist for all those years, but now most people know him as the narrator of the Anchorman movies. So. but he had Ron Burgundy in his set.
Yeah, had a cutout of him. Yeah,
Yes, no problem with that. He loved it. Oh,
yeah, he
great.
did.
Well, Aubrey, welcome back. You've been off enjoying life. How's life?
Life is still there. Life is still there. So yeah, it was great. Had a nice little trip out west. I don't know, the Dakotas west. I mean, they're west of me.
Mm-hmm.
That's
still
west.
technically-
Yeah,
Sure.
I count him as
Not
west.
quite to the Rockies, but yeah, had a great trip. I loved, it was so different. And it's been on my list for so long. So I was really excited to go.
Well, your pictures were cool. Looks like you had a good time. Are you
Thank you.
relaxed? Are you
So
re-energized?
it's one of those
reinvigorated?
vacations where I did not get a chance to fully relax, and for a couple different reasons. But I may take some more, like a little long weekend here and there to kind of decompress just a little bit. And but it was just one of those things where it was very busy. But I marked a lot of things off my list that I've always wanted to see. We ended up kind of picking a really good week because I know Sturgis starts August 6th. And so I was looking at the 2 weeks kind of before that, wanting to give a little buffer. And then the week after I left is when the smoke picked up again and the temperatures were even hotter. I mean, it was hot enough a few days, felt 100 degrees, which I haven't since 2012. And it was even hotter that next week. So I ended up picking a really good week. We had a little haze early on in the week, but it was not horrible. It definitely was a lot worse the following week. So I picked a fantastic week, and that's not me being able to forecast 6 months out. It's just the luck of the draw.
Oh,
Your
I
AccuWeather
I did not
app.
use AccuWeather's 90-day forecast.
All right. So, Jen, we got an eastern trough. I bet you wasn't too hot in Ohio today.
That was great. Highs in the 70s, lows in the 50s, which is great. I'm still without air conditioning. I bought one of those small room units. I'm going to see if I can limp along through the rest of the summer and hold off. So last week I needed it because it was pretty warm, but then I've been pretty good here the past couple of days, and humidity comes back up later and we are really dry. I need to check the deficit, but we don't have a lot of rain. We had a nice pop up yesterday, but not a lot for the next week. So we actually don't have really anything substantial until maybe Monday. So we'll see how it rolls. So I'm just doing my thing.
Doing your thing. That's all we
Doing
can
my
do.
thing. That's right.
And again, we for those that listen, you probably don't notice, but a lot of people watch us live, and we were off last week. We had some vacation schedules, so we did 2 shows 2 weeks ago, but we are back on the Monday night schedule. And for those that watch and listen live, I'm strapped in until Christmas. So that's just my next week off. Bill Murray, you were on vacation last week. You went to Aruba, Jamaica.
Well, close. Perdido Key, Florida.
That's close enough. Yeah.
Not quite the same cachet, but we did have some interesting weather, James. One of the biggest, most beautiful thunderstorms. You retweeted the picture of it. It looked like a mushroom cloud from an atomic bomb, and it petered out right before it got to us, but it did give us a lot of good lightning as it approached. And it just was a beautiful week, although it was kind of hot. It was in the lower 90s the whole time, and upper 70s at night. But by the time you get to late July on the Gulf Coast, it's just one big heat and humidity palooza for sure. So, but we had a good time. Everybody said, hey, you take 4 teenage boys to the beach, you're going to be tired when you get back. But they were wonderful, and we were all rested, and so we're back and ready to go at it.
All right, well, let's rock and roll. Let's bring in our guest before he runs and bails.
Well, let's hope he doesn't. But tonight's guest WeatherBrain grew up in Massachusetts. I don't think if you were listening a few minutes ago, you could miss the Boston accent there probably. But he got his undergraduate from St. Louis University. I think that's right. His PhD, though, I know from the University of Washington. He's been at the University of Wisconsin, though, for 27 years. He's a professor in the Department of Atmospheric and Oceanic Sciences. Dr. Jonathan Martin, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Bill, and thank you, James, and the rest of the staff. And you got everything right, Bill. 100% right on all those facts.
That's good, because usually I mess those things up, and it's kind of hard to mispronounce your name. So I figured I would get something wrong somewhere there along the way in the bio. But you grew up in Massachusetts, and that played a role in getting interested in weather, right?
Played a huge role, Bill. Yeah, I grew up in Peabody, Massachusetts. I was born in Salem, the famous witchcraft town, and the adjacent town is Peabody, spelled Peabody for everybody the rest of the country, but Peabody, if you live there, it's a dead giveaway. That you don't if you say it the wrong way. And yeah, it's right at the entrance to the Atlantic storm track. Of course, I didn't know that when I was a young boy, but my dad woke me up when I was a 5-year-old boy to see Neil Armstrong make the first footprints in the lunar soil. And then 3 years later, I got a morning paper route, and I'll tell you, every time it snowed in the wintertime, I was Neil Armstrong making footprints in the lunar surface. And that thrill never ever left me. So I've studied snowstorms ever since. And they got more and more magical the more you learn about them. They don't lose their phenomenological appeal as they become an intellectual entity, not just a phenomenological one. It's thrilling.
Now, I saw that word in your bio, and I don't think I've ever seen it used before, so maybe I just don't get out much. But talk about what phenomenology is, and
I guess
define
for
it
me,
for us.
yeah, I use that word to suggest, one can be excited to watch it snow, for instance, see the temperature drop, see the wind howl. All of those are phenomena associated with the storms. So the simple phenomenology of experiencing a storm is what I mean when I say that. And so I think the first year I was in the undergraduate major at St. Louis U, I do remember having a sort of a depression in my interest because I thought I was going to be taking classes where everybody was just going to talk about how thrilling it is to be out in a snowstorm or out in some other kind of weather. And then I realized, no, it looks like you have to learn some of this dynamics and this thermodynamics. And for a short time, that made things less interesting. But I can distinctly remember the recovery from that short period. Maybe you've all experienced the same thing where you realize, wait a minute, these beautiful entities get even more interesting when you learn about them in a rigorous way. That certainly happened to me, and that thrill has never left me.
So talk about your time in St. Louis and in your undergraduate. You alluded to it there. Kind of go into it a little more.
Sure. St. Louis U was a great place to go to school. I went to a Catholic high school in Danvers, Massachusetts, another adjoining town to my own hometown. And it was a Catholic school, and it was a really good preparatory school. But a lot of the kids who went there were from quite wealthy families. I was not. And I was there on scholarship. And so they were all aiming for the Ivy Leagues and all the rest. And so after a couple of years at that high school, I started to think, well, why shouldn't I be aiming for that? But then I realized that Dartmouth and Harvard and all these other places that you hear about don't have programs in meteorology. And I kept coming home and telling my dad and my mother, I'd say, I can't go to any of those schools. I really want to study the weather. I was hooked. And so St. Louis U was a protest choice for me at the time, actually, because the guidance counselors were all sort of pushing the top students to go to the Ivy Leagues. And I kept telling them, nope, I don't want to study anything they have. I don't care about engineering. I don't care about any of that. I want to study the weather. So I stopped going to guidance meetings and did it all on my own. And it was the best choice I ever made because St. Louis U was a great school. We had an intimate, small program. I don't know if any of you know Dr. Jim Moore, rest his soul. He was a fantastic mentor. Henry Fuhlberg, who's at Florida State, was a mentor of mine while he was at SLU. And Albert Pahlmann, who was from Cologne, Germany. He was in the resistance to the Nazis at the end of the war. He was a hero. So there were all sorts of luminous personalities from the whole gamut of life experience that I interacted with there. And so that gave me a great start for my career as a meteorologist. Absolutely spectacular place to go.
Take us through the next couple of steps, how you got to Washington and then on to Madison.
Yeah, so the Washington was a really interesting story. I was working for Henry Fuhlberg as a research assistant, not doing anything interesting because I didn't know anything, but he took a shine to me, and so I was in his lab with a bunch of other smarter people. And but he told me there's a field program, and Jim Moore told me too, there's a field program, John, that's going to be off the East Coast in the winter of 1986, January, February, and March, studying East Coast snowstorms. And it was called the Genesis of Atlantic Lows Experiment, GALE. And from what I could determine, there was one person in charge of it, and that was Peter Hobbs at the University of Washington. So I called him up. I graduated a semester early from SLU. And so it was November and December of 1985 that I was making my inquiries. And so I called Peter Hobbs and said, Dr. Hobbs, have you got any space for somebody to work as a graduate student with you? He said, I sure do. And we had about a series of 5-minute conversations. He later bragged to me that he never had a longer phone conversation than 5 minutes. And I asked him, even with your wife? He said, even with her. And after having met Sylvia, I was surprised at that answer. But anyway, that's a little bit of a diversion. But so I ended up going to the University of Washington to work in the field in North Carolina before I started my graduate career there, which was just great. And I went down there as this young kid. I didn't know anything, but I was raised to, if you don't know anything, don't let anybody think that you know anything. So I did okay in that setting, even with my ignorance, but learned a lot in the process. And then I got to Washington as a student in September of '86, and I was finished with my PhD in April of 1992, 3 weeks before my daughter was born. So that's kind of funny how everything came crashing down at once. I had a 2-year postdoc with Hobbs afterwards to do our Stormfest, our cyclone study in the central United States, which again involved lots of different universities, and that was interesting. And then I came to the University of Wisconsin in 1994. And I remember I when I interviewed, and I was done with the first day of the 2-day interview, I called my wife, of course, and I told her I just have to get this job. This is the right place for us. And I was right. 27 years later, I don't have a single regret about it. I can't believe I was so lucky.
Yeah. So talk about Dr. Hobbs for a second.
Yeah.
You mentioned him and kind of how he was. Talk about his impact on our field.
Yeah. Hobbs was a tireless, hard-working scientist. He was raised in England. He was a Londoner, actually, and born in 1936. And so when the Blitz came on in 1940, like a lot of little kids in London, he was sent out to the country to live in places that were far away from the city to save their lives and save them from the horrors of the war. And that instilled in him a toughness that was not immediately evident when you met him or talked to him, but he absolutely refused to give ground on anything. And sometimes that rubbed people the wrong way. Some of his peers didn't like that about him. He was a little bit too hard-edged. But I can tell you, as a graduate mentee of Peter Hobbs, and he was a pugilist. He fought in his teens. He was sort of a boxer, and so we really learned that sport. And he was in your corner when you were one of his students. And I will never ever say a bad word about him, because that's the only thing I can remember about him. In terms of our graduate interaction, was he was always in my corner. We worked on some somewhat controversial, although they shouldn't have been, controversial ideas, and he never backed down. And he trusted me, was another thing. He trusted me that as I continued to pursue that line of inquiry, that I was doing it rigorously so that whatever I said could be defended. And I really appreciated that trust. He was a great guy.
Now, you talk like you have a deep interest in history, especially World War II, and that'll play an important role as we get into our main subject tonight. But did you inherit that growing up, or did you get it from some of these, figures that you talked about that were in the resistance or lived in England during World War II?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, Bill. I'd never really thought about it with respect to World War II. I would say that my interest in history was nurtured by where I grew up, to be honest with you. And that doesn't mean that everybody who grows up in Peabody or Salem has that interest, but I did. And my grandfather was very interested in history. So he informed me a couple of years into my Little League career, I guess, that we were playing on a field at the time was called Cy Tenney Field, that was originally owned by Giles Corey, who was pressed to death during the witch trials. So immediately my love of baseball and my interest in history and my love for my grandfather came to an intersection point there. And I never lost an interest in history. In fact, I liked it enough that was what I did for reading in the background, just for pleasure through college. And it turns out, I know some of you might know Lance Bossart, a famous meteorologist up at SUNY Albany, who's now retired, but not stopped working. Lance is an amazing guy too. He told me that he almost decided to be a history major, and he has the same bug. So I'm not alone, but and I know there's quite a number of other people, but even some in our own field, is my point. So yeah, I've had that interest for a long time. But I will point this out too, that in my first year of graduate school, we used Wallace and Hobbs textbook. And it was the first time I'd ever seen a textbook annotated in quite, fairly a large number of instances where giants in the field who might have been mentioned in the text, you got a little bit of a historical anecdote about those people. So one had the idea that, Lord Kelvin was a real person and that Helmholtz was a real person and so on. And there were little stories about these people. So that, I think, added to an already existing background interest in history for me, but it helped to blend into a history of science interest as well.
So you wrote a book that was published earlier this year about Reginald Sutcliffe.
Yes.
Talk about how you came to be interested in him, and first give us an overview of what his contribution to our field has been.
Yeah, in fact, the answer to both questions is somewhat unified. So I'll start with, as you requested, I'll say what I think I could sum up as Sutcliffe's greatest contribution. We know a lot about the nature of what it is that forces cyclones and anticyclones to develop, to get more intense in either of their modes. We also know a lot about the vertical motion distribution in cyclones on the mesoscale, on the frontal scale. And it turns out that Sutcliffe was the very first person to come to an understanding of why there are dynamical forcings and what those dynamical forcings are that drive both development and frontal circulations. And I didn't discover that. This is the second part of an answer to your first question. I didn't really discover that until after I was, luckily given the job at Wisconsin in the spring of '94, and I was going to arrive in the fall. So my first teaching assignment was going to be teaching the synoptic senior level synoptic class. And so I wanted to make sure I did a nice job on the synoptic dynamics. So I began to put my notes together right away in April of 1994. And that's where, over a period of weeks, it occurred to me in that process that Sutcliffe really had a monopoly on all of those fundamental contributions to understanding weather systems at the middle latitudes. And so that was in the back of my mind for many, many years. I thought, this guy is someone I barely heard about. Professor Dick Reed at Washington had great respect for Reggie Sutcliffe, but he didn't draw all of the different strands of his influence together for me. But when I started to put my own notes together, I realized it myself. And I thought, someday I want to get back to this and really investigate this person's life, because where did it come from? Where did all the inspiration come from? And how was it that just one weather brain came up with all of this stuff and set us on a course that actually eventually led to numerical weather prediction? So that's what the book ended up, the project involving the book got me going on.
So talk about his early life, his days growing up. It seems like there might have been some similarities to your life, to me, in reading the book, even though I was reading it over an iPhone on the beach last week. You see how I let weather get into even my vacations. And it
Bill, I'm
kind of hard to read 6 lines at a time, but I got it. I did get it read.
I'm sorry to have ruined your vacation, and I warned you ahead of time that it might just do that, but I apologize again. But I think I had better circumstances to grow up in than Sutcliffe did. His father was a victim, like so many people born in the middle of or late part of the 19th century in England, of factory labor as a child. And so he did not have an education. And it was as a result of those horrors that the British government and British society, over a period of years, probably lasting about 60 to 80 years, from 1850 to 1820 to early 1900-ish period, that a series of rules were enacted that actually ameliorated those conditions. And so Reggie came along, born in 1904, to a lower middle class family. His dad was the produce manager at the Cleckheaton Cooperative, and his mother didn't work outside the house. And there were 4 boys who survived, with 3 who survived. There was 1 who died early, and of something that wouldn't kill a kid today. Diphtheria doesn't kill anybody in the Western world today, but it did in 1900. And so they didn't have, none of the Sutcliffes up to Reggie's generation had ever even gone to university. And it was not certain that he would, even though he was an outstanding student. And he had to win scholarships that were sponsored by the state and then by the school itself to actually make that happen. And so I had a better run of it than he did. But, my parents were grade school teachers. When my mother worked, she was. My dad was a grade school teacher his whole career. So we weren't from great means, but we certainly were better off than the Sutcliffes. And so he went to school to study mathematics. And as impossible as it may sound to today's ears, when you graduated even with a PhD in mathematics in 1927, you did not have your pick of jobs. Today, you could do just about anything. You could be working on Wall Street. You could be working for a big law firm. You could be doing a million things with a high-level mathematics degree, because there's so much analysis involved, and it's so well respected by such a wide array of fields of inquiry and industry, but not so in 1927. And so somebody tipped him off at the University of Leeds to the fact that one place where mathematics graduates sometimes go, though apparently very reluctantly, was the meteorological office. So he called them up and he had an interview with, it turns out he interviewed with Sir David Brunt of I think University of London fame. And he wrote books on dynamics later on, but he got an interview with David Brunt during their summertime. No one was there. It was a 5-minute interview. And I guess Brunt had been charged with the idea that if, unless this person is an utter disaster, personally hire him. So it was a 5-minute interview. He was hired and he started on September 30th, 1927, which incidentally was the same day Babe Ruth hit his 60th home run in that record-setting season.
Everything ties back to baseball. So
it's pretty hard to deny that.
So was he affected by the British obsession with weather, or did he just kind of blunder into this sort of blindly? All of us have our little story about how we loved weather, and it seems like he may not have been impacted to that degree, but everyone in Britain is obsessed with the weather.
It's a weather obsessed country, but he stood alone, almost alone, in having little or no interest in the weather as a young boy. That's his daughters told me that he used to tell them that all the time, that he really didn't. So he did stumble into this somewhat accidentally. He may have had a run-in the last year of his high school with a physics master who came back from World War I and was part of the British rainfall survey. So he may have taken instrument readings and so on, but he would have done it to please his physics master, with whom he had a long-standing, very affectionate, and very influential relationship. But it wasn't because he was interested in the weather. So no, unlike many of us who see this field as a vocation that's inescapable from the time you're conscious almost, not true for Sutcliffe. It was a choice. And yet he still made these great contributions.
Now, you mentioned 1927, but 1927 and 1928 were highlighted by big weather events in Europe, right?
In England, especially, there were a couple of big weather events. It was a major flood in January after some heavy snow around Christmas time, 1927. It was flooding in London. I think it was the last time that anyone died in a flood in the city of London. Was January, whatever it was, second week of January 1928. And there had been a 30 or so inch snowfall in the Cotswolds, which are just out to the west of the city, and 10 or so inches in the city itself. And some of the lower lying close to the shore of the Thames, I think Lambeth is the name of the municipality in the London area. It was a slummy part of town. It may still be now, I'm not familiar, but it was then. And so the housing wasn't well constructed. There weren't regulations to keep the river rising out of them and so on. So people drowned in their beds.
And talk for a minute about the state of the art of meteorology at that point in the 1920s, both on the Weather Service level and on understanding of the atmosphere, because we didn't have a lot of upper air data or anything, and mostly everything was done at the surface, right?
That's right. There were occasional balloons. The technology seems to have existed from the early 1920s on, but it was expensive, and no one was really working to refine it, not only to make it less expensive, but to incorporate it as really part of the enterprise. And so radiosondes were extraordinarily rare all the way through most of World War II, but certainly in the late 1920s. And so almost all of the analysis that was done on weather systems was done by analyzing surface observations. And everywhere except the Scandinavian countries, there was a reluctance to adopt the Norwegian model, which was the revolution around 1920, brought on by the Bergen School and the Bjerknes family, effectively Wilhelm and Jakob and friends. And so in England, the Norwegian methods were really not widely used when Sutcliffe began his weather service career. They certainly were not widely used here in the United States. In fact, Carl Gustav Rossby himself came across to work at the Weather Bureau in the mid-1920s as an emissary, a sort of apostle of the Norwegian methods. And that's described in Mark Friedman's excellent book, Appropriating the Weather, the life history of Wilhelm Bjerknes. And so, yeah, it's really, really interesting. Sutcliffe had a run-in with one of the Bergen disciples, Tor Bergeron, about a year into his weather service career, meteorological office career. He was sent to Malta, which was only 6 years a British protectorate by then, 1928. And the idea was, Malta's in the central Mediterranean, and the British had a lot of possessions and strategic outposts from Gibraltar all the way to Cairo and the Suez Canal across the Mediterranean. And Mussolini was several years into his dictatorship of Italy with an expressed desire to reconquer the Mediterranean. And so the British were a little bit concerned. They wanted to make sure they knew something about the weather and the ability to move fleets of aircraft, but mostly ships across the Mediterranean. So Sutcliffe was sent to Malta as part of a 4-person or a 5-person forecasting outpost. And as luck would have it, Bergeron had just been commissioned by the British Meteorological Office to go down there and talk about the Norwegian analysis methods and their efficacy, yes or no, for talking about smaller scale Mediterranean storms. And this provided an enormous adrenaline shot for Sutcliffe a year and a half into his weather service or meteorological office career, where he was really losing hope that there was anything worth it here, because there was no rigorous science. And this gets to your maybe your primary question there. The state of the science of weather forecasting was quite unscientific at the time. It was more or less a joke. And that's why people would take those jobs with math degrees as a last resort. There was nothing really to do as a meteorological office scientist at the time.
Aviation was really important, and that was a lot of what was going on there, was trying to understand the weather for that, in addition to, as you said, the marine interest. So in 1937, he's like working on meteorology for aviators, which probably had to be huge at the time. And you mentioned it was rather beneath him.
Yeah, except that it gave him an opportunity. He seemed to recognize the opportunity that was sitting there waiting if he had a chance to put the book together. I'll tell the story a little bit more completely. I've jumped into the middle of it. Around 1937, Sutcliffe was transferred to the south coast of England. It's a great place to live, apparently. Most people who live in that country like to visit there. And he was thrilled to live there, he and his wife, Evelyn. And the task there was training meteorological office personnel and also testing commercial and military pilots on elementary meteorology. And the problem at the time that Sutcliffe recognized was there was no kind of coherent syllabus for this training, and there was certainly no textbook around which that syllabus could be structured. And so he made the bold suggestion to the director of the meteorological office, why don't you commission somebody to write a textbook and really put this education system together, both for commercial and military use? And to his surprise, but great surprise, it was a thrill, the director said, why don't you write the book? So he got to, and further, the director said, the office is not a really amenable place to do that work. So why don't you do it at home on the south coast of England with your 1-year-old daughter in your house? And she's about to begin speaking. So, I mean, what parent wouldn't be thrilled by this opportunity? So they gave him a 6-month leave. It wasn't really a leave because he worked on the book, but he was 6 months at home writing the book. And of course, the writing required that he did his first serious reading in meteorology. So it was at this project's behest that he learned what was wrong with the science. It went beyond the impression that he had. He really saw, wait a minute, I've been right all along. There's no rigor to the way we think about cyclones and anticyclones. We don't have any idea how anticyclones develop, and we have barely an idea how cyclones develop. And those ideas are all wrong, as it turns out. So that really lit him up. And then he went on to his 2 years of exceptional creativity and contribution after writing that novel, not that book. And he also got to he was at home when his daughter's first words were spoken, and they were in the Welsh language, it says it turns out. So.
That is just awesome. So events in the 1930s in Europe are starting to take an ominous turn, of course. And how did that affect Sutcliffe and his family and his career?
Yeah, that was a tragic for everybody. Of course, what a disaster, and a needless disaster. The Allies had many opportunities to let Hitler know they were not going to put up with him, but they didn't do it. The primary one that Sutcliffe may have had some sort of sense of and some opinion of, although none of that's recorded, he didn't have a diary. He was down in Alexandria in 1935 into the first few months of 1936. And this was a show of force by the British fleet against Mussolini, who was really saber rattling. And that was the Abyssinian crisis. And he went in and he took on defenseless Ethiopia. I mean, what a he-man, right? And but he had the biggest submarine fleet in the world at the time. And so this was a real threat. A month or two after that subsided in the Mediterranean, Hitler was well aware that the Allies were feckless. And so he marched into the Rhineland. And that was the beginning of Hitler's overt aggression, which for 3+ years went unchecked until finally September 1st, 1939, the the made-up invasion of Poland by the Germans forced the British hand and forced the rest of the Allies to say, we can't let this go any longer. And Sutcliffe had just published in April of 1939 what many consider, in fact, Brian Hoskins is one of those people who considers it Sutcliffe's greatest contribution, which was the forerunner paper to what later came after the war and was the development theorem. I might have an argument with Hoskins about that, but both of them are braided together. And so Sutcliffe was on the ascendancy to have an international reputation as the leading scientist in weather system science. Without question, he was the top dog. And as soon as he reached that status, the war intervened. And to bring baseball in again, and I don't mean to make light of the war, but the notion that DiMaggio, Bob Feller, Ted Williams all gave up critical prime years of their career to the war was shared across disciplines and across enterprises. Sutcliffe was a victim in academic and research science of exactly the same fate as those great ball players were, because his career was interrupted at precisely the wrong time. He was 35 years old, top dog in the field, a challenger to Rossby for the very most famous atmospheric scientist in the world, and the war consumed his energies after that.
And so he finds himself doing a very important work, though.
Oh, yes, he did.
At that point. So talk about that for a minute, because that's fascinating. What he was having to do, it really, played a big role in turning the tide in the Battle of Britain.
Yeah, it's definitely true. He had ups and downs during the war. There were times where there was some really serious energy and great creativity, bursts of creativity that led to operational advances that really did advance the Allied cause. And there were other times where he felt he and other of his colleagues, not just him, he wasn't a selfish person from what I can tell, and a self-centered person, but he certainly thought that their expertise was being wasted. One of those times was probably shared by many servicemen in all sorts of capacities during the phony war of November 39 until May of 1940. And he was in northern France for all of that time, doing nothing. And then the German offensive in late April into May brought the tide quickly to a resolution in northern France. And so he had to leave Boulogne in May 23rd, I think it was he was on one of the last carriers out of Boulogne, shipped to safety in Dover. And then a week later, he was sent behind enemy lines in southern France to work on something called Operation Haddock Force, which had an intended objective to bomb Turin and Milan, the northern industrial cities of Italy, leaving from French soil, so down in the southern part of France. But the French got cold feet, and so the whole thing fell apart in the second week of June. And they were still in France after the capitulation of the French to the Germans. And so the word on the street from the BBC and back in England was any English serviceman who is unaccounted for after June 20th or so is either a prisoner of war, dead, or you won't hear from them again for other reasons. And so this word landed in Oxford, where Sutcliffe's wife was with their 4-year-old daughter. And of course, you can imagine the sadness that came hearing this. And yet Sutcliffe, unbeknownst to Evelyn, was on his way back, zigzagging across the North Atlantic in a convoy, landing in Liverpool July 1st. And he sent a telegram, and the telegram picture is right in the book. It was the first thing I saw when I visited this Ellen Sutcliffe, his oldest daughter, several years ago. It's framed, and it says on it, "Feeling grand, see you soon, feeling grand, love, Reggie." And Ellen could remember, even though she was only 4 at the time, how light the house suddenly felt when they got that news. And so her dad arrived home in a day or two, and he had about a week off. And then he was sent down to Bomber Command in London. And that was right at the beginning of the Battle of Britain. They decided we're wasting his talents here. They sent him to 3 Group of Bomber Command down in Newmarket, Southeast England. And he spent 3+ years as the senior meteorological officer of the Bomber Command in Newmarket. And they had responsibility for the northern German industrial cities and some of the French industrial cities, the Renault factory and Lorient and some other places. So they were constantly running sorties, and he was forecasting the weather for not only departure and arrival, but also for locations bombing. And he quickly realized through the repartee that he and his colleagues developed with the pilots, who were completely a different type of warrior than the scientists, but they realized that if they worked together, they would learn a lot more and save a lot more lives. And so the debriefs after these flights were extraordinarily informative. And you had to have the right kind of personality. So Sutcliffe was, I never met him, but he was apparently this sort of not only a brilliant scientist, but an everyday person. And so he could cross those lines easily. And that's rare, as you, you probably know, in academic world. It's not that common. I mean, the academic world tends to capture people who have a hard time talking about baseball or a hard time smiling and laughing. I mean, it's just a fact. I love my colleagues, but let's be honest, that's generally the case. And so anyway, Sutcliffe was able to bridge that sometimes what's a social gap. And he began to realize there's ways we might be able to improve flight level wind forecasting. And the way he did it was through the reading he'd done with aviation, meteorology for aviators. The Germans had experimented with isobaric coordinates in the 1920s, but not really pushed it, not really asserted it as an advantage. And Sutcliffe really began to experiment with isobaric coordinates for the use of drawing thickness lines, which you could, just maybe differences in the geopotential height at two different levels that would be related to the column average temperature. They had air mass technique ways of figuring out what was the column average temperature, not just based on surface observations. That some of those methods are now extinct. I never learned them myself, but they were quite good. And so you could make short-term forecasts of the weather, both at the site as well as en route back and forth. And for those efforts, he was recognized by somebody in the higher up command because he was given an OBE for that work, Order of the British Empire. And that was the beginning of an award period during Sutcliffe's military service, which was really quite remarkable.
And he got to meet the king, or
yeah, the king,
if I remember correctly.
King George VI, I think, bestowed that honor on him. And the king was apparently quite interested in meteorology. And so the rumor was in the Sutcliffe family that he actually chatted with him for a few minutes at the investiture about the weather. So it could well be the case. It's unverified.
It's fascinating to me how they had to forecast the weather, obviously with very little information, but talk about the data they had, because I guess, the surface observations, on the continent were there, but what else did they have at their disposal?
Yeah, and don't forget the surface observations on the continent were severely compromised in the regions where they were going. This was all German-held territory. So they were relying on resistance observations. And imagine putting your life on the line for a surface ob in Hamburg. But people were doing it routinely. And then there were the occasional radiosonde, which was sent by the resistance, all in code, and amazing, just amazing. So that's a whole other story. But they were mostly using surface obs, as much as you could squeeze out of the surface obs. In fact, I think the Allied presence in Iceland, especially the United States presence in Iceland, was specifically designed to take a regular observation at Reykjavik. So we had something upstream to know something more than the Germans did about what might be developing in the weather downstream over the North Atlantic and Western continental Europe. So all of this was strategic. It's just amazing. One could write a whole nother book on just that. But it was mostly surface obs and creative use of theory. And that's where I think the great genius of people like Sutcliffe, and there were probably others, he was the highest profile, I'm sure, for the British. Sitting down with a pencil and paper and saying, okay, here's the constraints. Here's the observations we can get. There's no sense in worrying about what we wish we could get. We're not going to get, it's like Apollo 13. Not even going to think about what we can't get. What can we do with what we have? And then you combine the available observations with rigorous theory, and you can actually squeeze a heck of a lot out of it. When you think about it, Bill, we have no right to expect we can get a reasonable estimate of the vertical motion from just the geopotential height at a series of levels in the atmosphere. There's no reasonable expectation that should be true. But the quasi-geostrophic system is very generous. It works well beyond the low Rossby number threshold, and it tells us a lot of things that we shouldn't have a reasonable expectation to get. And so in a similar way, I think the creative geniuses of people like Sutcliffe during the war were squeezing enormous amounts of useful information out of a paltry set of data, but it was mostly surface data.
And they relied on some reconnaissance flights, right?
Yeah,
that was important.
That's true. There was a whole reconnaissance branch. I think some of it flew out of 3 Group for a while, but not the entire war. And then, of course, the debriefs. So in-flight data from pilots, even if it was after the fact, was useful because it would either confirm or deny what the analysis strategy had been that day. And one could begin to gain confidence in a certain analysis method, or decide that whatever they had been trying that week wasn't working. Let's abandon that and go back to something else. Now that's only true if the observations behaved. And I say behaved in a sense that when Allied pilots, even in the European theater, encountered extraordinary headwinds on the way back to England, they did not report them because they were afraid they would be criticized for being either asleep at the wheel or some other sort of human error, even though, because they didn't know anything about the jet stream. So there was no suspicion that there could be 100-knot winds blowing from the northwest from England toward northern Germany, but they were encountered routinely. And by the end of the war, I think the airmen started to get a little more confidence to say, look, I'm fed up lying to these guys or trying to hide the fact that we had a 100-knot headwind. I'm going to tell them. And so that was one of the ways in the European theater that it dawned on some of the scientists like Sutcliffe that there was something going on with this jet stream. And then, of course, that fit into a theory that was based on strong baroclinicity and the relationship to the jet.
And you mentioned the reconnaissance. Did they do any deciphering of German transmissions of weather information? Because obviously the Germans had a good weather organization in their areas. Could they steal any information using their decryption methods?
Yeah, I have no particular firsthand knowledge of high profile such examples from my own research, but I'm pretty certain that was done. And it was done in a statistically savvy way, as I think we know generally now, as portrayed in the movie, The Imitation Game, that came out some years ago about Bletchley Park and Alan Turing. The notion that once they decoded the Enigma, and I think they used some weather reports as a way to really get that decoding moving in the right direction, because there are certain repeatable phrases in each weather decoded statement. You can't really, hide that. And so the weather was a key element in helping to begin that decryption. But the notion that they could steal such weather reports, they couldn't do it wholesale because it would be too obvious to the enemy. So you had to once in a while pretend you didn't have an observation, just on a statistical basis to make it look like, there was nothing going on in terms of decryption. So that was a whole meta level of strategy that was going on there. Great chess players these people were.
It really was three-dimensional chess in a lot of ways, because
Yep.
you mentioned a couple of in the book, which is, as you can tell, Jen, this is a fascinating book. You feel like you were there. There were methods that both sides couldn't employ because they were afraid the other side might find out about them and employ them against them. And then you find out later they already knew about it and were afraid to employ it themselves.
Yeah, so interesting. I think you're referring to the tinfoil strips of paper that were dropped by British aircraft. They held that secret for a very long time until they really tried to organize these 1,000 sortie raids. And what it did is, of course, it interfered with the German reconnaissance, ground reconnaissance of where the aircraft were. It just put so much clutter in the air for their radar. And the Germans had the exact same thing, as you point out, for a couple of years, but didn't want to disclose that they had it. Because I think once you find a piece of paper that you didn't drop, that has tinfoil on one side and is just paper on the other, you'd say, if you hadn't already invented it, what a great idea. That just puts all this disinformation into my radar. So you didn't want to give it away if you didn't have to. And then the British also tried the ingenious but so easy to screw up plan of sending different colored, what do they call them? Flares for pathway. So they had a Pathfinder mission in the Royal Air Force. So they would try because the bombing targets were really missing quite a bit. So they'd send different colored flares down. But once the Germans discovered what they were doing, which took about 3 days, they started throwing, artificial misinformation flares of various colors in the way, and that screwed that up. So it's amazing all the stuff that went on.
So I tell my sixth graders every year the forecast for D-Day was obviously critical.
Yeah.
And you get into that a bit in the book, and it seems that Sutcliffe had no use for Crick.
He sure
along the way. he wouldn't
did.
elucidate it, but
Yeah.
he didn't have any love lost for him for sure.
Crick had the notion that analog forecasting in 1944 was really the way to go. And so the Caltech group was really controlling, I think, the U.S. component of the Allied weather forecasting, where it was Pedersen was the main brain in the Allied side, the British side of the Allied weather forecasting, and Pedersen and Sutcliffe shared the sense that one really has to have a rigorous science that underlies and dynamics that underlies trying to make a forecast. And so they did not see eye to eye. And apparently Crick had really rubbed Sutcliffe the wrong way professionally in other locations. And you're right, we don't know exactly what those details were, partly because Sutcliffe tried to keep his cards close to his chest, but also partly because the tape recorder in a famous interview that he was on broke down while he was talking about Crick. So he may have actually disclosed it at one point, but we don't know what he said.
That is too amazing. So, of course, the war ends successfully, but even before the victory in Europe, there were already plans on the Allied side about rebuilding the German civilization. Obviously, obviously we didn't want Europe to continue to sink into the bog, but they were actually planning on the rebuilding of their weather service, you mentioned, and I thought that was fascinating.
Yeah, that was a major component, and you put it exactly the right way. I don't think I did that in the book. I wish I had. It's a great way to put it. The rebuilding of the German civilization, which is what they did. And the Allies committed to this in 1942, early 1942. And this was before the tide of the war turned. It wasn't until the late summer of 42 that it really turned, both in the Pacific and in the European theater. But even then, turning means crossing the 51% threshold. So, there was no guarantee even at that point. But the commitment to rebuild both Germany and Japan after the war was made long before it was certain we were going to win the war. And a major component of the rebuilding of the German civilization was the German scientific infrastructure, which a primary aspect of that was the German Meteorological Office, which was well respected before the war. In fact, as you know, Sutcliffe did his reading in French and German because that's where all the science was. And I'd say the predominance was in German, maybe thankfully to the Scandinavian countries, but the Germans held the ascendancy from the 1880s to about 1920s in meteorological science. And so Germans and Austrians. So it was a tremendous foresight that the Allies looked at that. And so when the war was over, that was Sutcliffe's job, was to rebuild the German weather service. And that took more than a whole year. It was a year and a half of constant effort, traveling around Germany, meeting with Germans, denazifying them, having interviews where you'd find out who was a strong, ally of the party, who was not, who was just doing their job as a scientist and so on, and trying to clear house and then rebuild it, which is a remarkable effort. But it couldn't have happened if it was decided on the spur of the moment. It had to have been planned. And the planning for that is, I guess we've already established that all of you are baseball fanatics. You know that you don't come into the dugout in the seventh inning and say, hey, nice no-hitter you've got going. The jinx is a huge part of trying to win important battles. And I don't think the war was any different. And yet imagine jinxing yourself, laying plans for the rebuilding of your assumed to be defeated adversaries. Unbelievable. And they did it.
Yeah, that really was a fascinating part of something I had never thought of. Of course, when I was preparing to study meteorology in the late 1970s and early 1980s, like if you attended Florida State, you were strongly encouraged to take German as your foreign language. And I never understood that until I talked to Dr. Harold Brooks a few years ago. Mm-hmm. And he said, all of the great research was written in German in the early part of the 20th century.
Yeah. Yep. Absolutely and true.
I'm really looking forward to going there next summer. Our son has studied German all through high school, and he mentioned that he wanted his senior trip to be to Germany, and I'm looking forward to that trip. I think that's going to be a blast.
Oh, great. Yeah.
So I'm really looking forward to that. So, Jennifer, this is just amazing stuff, because I've just touched on the outline of this book, but Dr. Martin, you bring it alive with all of these stories. How did you learn all of this? Because that's got to be a gift to be able to take us as the reader into those situations, where you don't exactly know, what might have happened. How did you do that?
That's such a kind comment for you to make. I really do appreciate that because, one never knows whether or not that comes across. I tried to tell a story. That's what I tried to do because I have great admiration for this individual. And I know that he's laid a foundation for what all of us enjoy. We all look at our cell phones to decide whether or not, regardless of season, what the weather might be the next 2 days or at a destination to which we're traveling. And that didn't happen by accident. That was a result of great industry, trial and error, and an enormous creativity and exceptionally hard work. And so I really appreciate that comment. It was not easy, but it was fun. So it turns out to have been easy. I went to England six or seven times during this process over a number of years. The first year I had a full year sabbatical. Half of it was from the state of Wisconsin. The other half was granted by the college because I'd been chair of my department for 9 years. So I got an extra long period of time, and I had some travel money from the for the university saying, thank you for your service as chair. So I used it for this. And most of the time I was at home in Madison. And I tried to do a lot of the research from home on the internet, trying to find things like marriage records and birth records and all the rest. Once I made contact through a librarian contact at the University of Reading with Sutcliffe's family, that opened a floodgate and changed the whole complexion of the project for me, because it made me realize that I want to tell a story about a human being in the context of the life and the times in which he lived, not just bore, the 80 people around the world who might be interested in hearing somebody talk about all of Sutcliffe's scientific papers. I think people are generally interested in weather and climate. And I think that they want to know where all these thinking and all this ideas come from. And so I wanted to tell the story, because I think even at the bus stop, people ask me, they don't know that I'm working at the university as a meteorology professor, but we talk about the weather casually. And it's hard for me to talk about it casually. And they kind of quickly realize I'm either a giant nerd or maybe a giant nerd. And so they're right. But, it's just the way things go. And having access to the National Archives in England, a great staff there, and I learned the ropes of how to get documents from them. And so I could order them the day before I was there, and I'd spend, 15 hours in one day there, and I'd go back the next day for 15 more. The cell phone helps because I could take pictures of these documents. I didn't have to take them home or kind of write down notes. And so then you can peruse them at your leisure. All sorts of modern conveniences made this work possible. And then I had, as I said, I really did have a passion to try and elevate Sutcliffe's profile to something that's at least somewhat equal to his contributions, because before that wasn't the case.
Now, I've sort of monopolized the conversation because I was so fascinated with the book. And Jen, I kind of left you sitting on the sidelines here. I know you're champing at the bit with some questions that I haven't asked here.
No, I mean, I love history as well. And especially the story aspect of everything. First of all, I think I need a radio sabbatical is what I've made the determination. So because I would love to just go travel to every library in the United States and go dig into all the tornado history. That would be my dream come true. But when you were learning about Sutcliffe's life, tell us a little bit more about the man Sutcliffe. What was his personality? How did people view him? What were some of his interests other than weather?
Yeah, that's a great question, Jen. I tried to recreate as much as I possibly could what his personality was like. And knowing his daughters, they've become friends of mine. I'm so lucky about that. And his in-laws, and then his grandkids and all the rest. One gets a pretty easy sense of what he was like. He had a wry sense of humor. He did not suffer fools professionally very well. So he'd state his mind at scientific conferences. He would insist on rigor as a scientist, but he had a great sense of humor. Every Christmas, they went to the old Victorian Theatre in London to see some Shakespeare or a Dickens. He enjoyed classical music. He was a voracious gardener. He spent all of his free time in the garden. In fact, his home in Ascot, which was a kind of a rich suburb of London. I think George Harrison and John Lennon lived there, for instance. He didn't know them. I'm not saying that, but that was the kind of area that it was. His backyard was famous for parties that his colleagues at the meteorological office would come to. And so he was a gregarious person, a glad-handing person. He was chair of the department at Reading. He was the initial chair of the Department of Meteorology at Reading. He ruled with an iron fist, but he, in the sense that the students approached him once, and this was the 60s, 65 to 70. They approached him and said, Professor Sutcliffe, we'd really like to have a student organization and, bring issues to the faculty. And he said, that's fine with me as long as I get to veto anything I don't agree with. And so they agreed with it. And I don't think you'd agree with that as a student 60s radical unless you really had respect for this person's honesty and integrity. So I think he comes across, from everything I could gather, as a really well-rounded, very top-notch kind of person you'd want to know. Hugh Davies, who's now retired from ETH in Zurich. He was hired by Sutcliffe at Reading in 1968. And he told me, I've known Hugh for a long time, and he told me that Sutcliffe was the gentleman's gentleman in the perfect sense of the word. So I guess that has a meaning that at least I can get a sense of from these other stories. So he was quite a guy. And he also has great sense of humor. Sir John Mason, who was Peter Hobbs's PhD advisor at Imperial College. So this is sort of incestuous. Sutcliffe quit the meteorological office because he didn't want to work for Mason. But Mason was well aware of Sutcliffe's wry sense of humor. So he tells a story about Sutcliffe. It's in the notes in the book. Sutcliffe was a big wig in the WMO, and they had a meeting in Geneva one year, and he decided to bring his colleagues out for refreshments afterwards. And he then applied for reimbursement of his check on that. And the Admiralty said, no, we don't reimburse alcohol. And so Sutcliffe wryly commented that he said, when I was a young boy, my mother told me that courtesy costs nothing. I now understand that that's also the policy of Her Majesty's government. So this is the kind of humor that he had. Just fantastic.
So
That is great.
keep going, Jen. Keep going. I don't want to.
Well, now, did he only have the one daughter?
He had two. His daughter, Ellen, was born in 1936, and his daughter, Jenny, who was a fashion model at the era of Twiggy. She was friends with Twiggy. And when my wife and I visited her in France, she lives in France now with her husband, Jacques. She had all of the Sutcliffe material out, including his autobiographical sketch, which serves as a backbone for some of the elements in the book, which was only rumored to exist. Her older sister said, don't trust it, John. Maybe she doesn't know what she has. She had it. It's a beautiful handwritten biography that he wrote himself. But my wife didn't care about that. She wanted to see Jenny's portfolio, which she generously showed. So we saw all of her historical portfolio stuff. She was, so she made a good living as a fashion model in the 60s in England. Isn't that something?
That is cool. And then how many grandkids then?
Let's see. I think he has now 11 grandkids.
Yeah.
No. I'm sorry. 6. I was thinking of great grandkids. He has 6 grandchildren and then 11 great grandchildren. Yeah.
And when did he pass away then?
May 28th, 1991.
Okay.
Yeah. And he suffered a stroke in April of that year, and he was incapacitated for much of the rest of the way. So that was a tragic way for a guy who was a marvelous communicator to go. But so that was the way it went.
Delving into his life as you have, what are some things that you admire the most about him? Because I'm doing a little writing myself, very little. I end up falling in love with a lot of these folks. I want to, I know we can't meet him, but you've met his family. And so what are just some things that you just were like, really admired him for?
And they don't show up in the book. It's a great question, Jen. One of them is his daughter, Ellen, his older daughter, failed her driver's license. She told me this story the first time she went out for her driver's license. And it wasn't for lack of practice. She'd been out with her dad a lot, trying to learn how to drive, operate a motor vehicle. And when she came back disappointed, probably 16, 17, I guess, I asked her, I said, so what did your dad think? And she said, the first thing he said to me was, tomorrow morning we'll go out again. So he didn't quit. He never quit. And he instilled that in his kids. His daughter, Jenny, was not good at school. Ellen was. She was a scholar. She did well in school. But his younger daughter, Jenny, was not as good a student. And then she got interested in traveling around Europe with her dad and her mother. They went to Italy a number of times. She fell in love with Rome. She got a job at a fashion house in Rome, and that started her modeling career. And I asked her, I said, so what did your dad and your mother think of that? Were they disappointed that you didn't go to school? And then she said, no, they were way ahead of their time in telling me, we don't care what you do as long as what you do is what you like to do, and just do it well. And so that was not something that you'd expect from sort of the sense we Americans have of a stuck-up British aristocracy. That wasn't the case. So those things really got my admiration, because that's kind of the way I've tried to raise my own children. I think you have to give them the best start you can, give them rules, but you don't know who they are. They don't know who they are, so you have to let them explore. And I really did appreciate that about him. And then the final thing was that it is mentioned in the book. I think he had an open mind about how to make assessments about individuals as scientists. And I mean that from this story. It was a young Indian fellow from one of the universities in India. They're all well-respected places. He was writing a dynamics PhD thesis. And so in some of those universities, the idea was to try and get acclaimed scientists from around the world, perhaps mostly Europe and maybe even mostly the Commonwealth, to try and be your PhD signatories at the end. And so Sutcliffe was on a PhD committee with Eric Eady, and I think the other was, I can't remember the name now, I'm not going to waste your time, but Eric Eady, who was the famous Eady model for baroclinic instability, and another famous atmospheric dynamicist, I can't remember the name, and Sutcliffe. And Eady and the other person were saying, well, there's not much new in this thesis. I think there's not enough novelty. And Sutcliffe backed them off and said, wait a minute. If we're asking a young person to make a novel contribution at the age of 25, we're asking too much. Is what he's done rigorous? Does it follow logically from pre-established things? And does it suggest he has the talent to move forward? If the answer to all three of those is yes, he deserves his degree. Sutcliffe swayed the committee. And so to me, that's the influence of a really generous but rigorous scholar. And I hope that, anyone who runs into a committee of any kind in the future finds a Sutcliffe type committee, because that's the right way to evaluate new science. So I admire that.
I tell you, I envy your students at the University of Wisconsin, because I think it would be an amazing experience to sit through a semester with you, Dr. Martin. Just tonight, you've regaled us with some fascinating things. Go on just a moment and talk about his role in the formation and development of numerical weather prediction, because I think that's really critical in putting a bow on the whole topic.
Yeah, thanks, Bill. That's a really interesting part of the story too. I'll begin by giving away the punchline. Sutcliffe was a lifelong skeptic in numerical weather prediction. He did not believe it would ever take the place of the expert judgment of the theoretician or the academic or operational meteorologist with great experience. He was wrong. So it's definitely matured well beyond what I think he expected for it. But the interesting thing about it is, right after the war was over, the Allies and the scientists on the Allied side looked around and said, hey, we've got a whole bunch of new tools. We've got computers. We've got, numerical methods that people are learning to program these computers. We've got new weather observations. We've got radiosondes. Maybe we can predict the weather. Rossby, Chani, and John von Neumann from Princeton took the computer and the theory and said, let's make the simplest possible atmospheric model. With Rossby had the idea, we'll learn something about what we don't know by doing so. And so they decided to make what was called the barotropic assumption. Many of you know what that is. It collapses the entire atmosphere effectively onto one layer. And what you do is you predict the evolution of the 500 millibar heights by numerical methods. That's valuable. Sutcliffe, meanwhile, is back in England now as director of the Meteorological Office research branch. And he says, wait a minute, I don't want to do that. That's not how the real atmosphere works. We have vertical motions that produce clouds and precipitation and force the development of cyclones and anticyclones. Remember, I wrote this paper in 1947 about the development theorem. Let's start there. So Sutcliffe recruits people like John Sawyer, the great John Sawyer, Bushby, Mavis Hines, the first woman research scientist in the British meteorological universe, and the first person to run an adjoint model, an amazing woman. So he's got all these people working for him, and they're trying to develop a baroclinic model of the atmosphere, a numerical baroclinic model. First, a two-layer model, much like the development theorem, and that's competing with the squashed into one-layer barotropic model in America. For a while, most of the 1950s, the barotropic advances were faster, and they garnered more headlines. Rossby in 1959 or 57, I think, December 57, just before he died, was on the cover of Time magazine. Weatherman Carl Rossby, because he was making advances in forecasting. And Sutcliffe and the British group were biding their time. It was a more challenging problem for them. But by the time the mid-1960s came along, the baroclinic model had already been adopted in the United States as well. And that was the future of numerical weather prediction, was trying to make forecasts of the three-dimensional vertical motion field, as well as the evolution of the pressure and height field at a variety of isobaric levels. So great advances were made by both sides. One of them outstripped the other in the initial run, and that left, I think, probably was one of the reasons why Sutcliffe's reputation was left a little bit lower profile than it deserved. But eventually, of course, now you hear sometimes, especially at hurricane season, oh, the European center model is so much better than anything we do in the United States. That's debatable, but the fact that there's such an argument is a function of Sutcliffe's insistence that we stick to a baroclinic model in the initial development of NWP in England.
So talk for a moment about some of your other research and the things you've done, because, you know, you make a point that we haven't learned everything we can learn about cyclones. There's still so much to discover. Talk about some of your highlights and some of the things that you are most excited about for the future.
Yeah, so some of the things that have really excited me in the past in my research have been really investigating the nature of occluded cyclones. So cyclones that get to their post-mature phase. The structure of them is interesting. They have quite interesting thermal structures. They also have an interesting distribution of vertical motion and precipitation in clouds. And that's what originally attracted me, both of those elements. But it turns out that you can unify those two elements of the occluded cyclone, the development of the thermal structure and the production of the clouds and precipitation in the northwest quadrant for the northern hemisphere of these storms, where the heavy snow often falls. And this gets back to my paper route as a kid. Those are all intertwined. The forcing for the vertical motion compels the production of the very thermal structure that also is intriguing about those storms. And so I had a series of papers on that in the 1990s, late 1990s, that I think that outlined that basic theory. And that was a thrill for me. And I remember at one point when all the tumblers came into the line there in the fall of 1997, when I first saw these things, I thought, you know, people probably have been wondering about when they've delivered papers in the morning with winds from the northwest and heavy snow, they might not know they're in the occluded quadrant. They would when they started studying it. But why is it snowing so heavily here? And then I had the understanding that heavy snow was intimately related to the production of the very thermal structure that makes those storms so interesting. And that was a thrill. It's like the first time, you're the first person to see behind the curtain on at least one problem. And boy, did that thrill me. That was a thrill. I've never gotten over it, in fact. And but you have to get over it, Bill, because you've got to go beyond what you've done in the past. You can't stay there. So, and that was a hard task for me, and it still is. When I come up with something that I find interesting, it's really hard to abandon it and go to the next problem. But as I get older, I'm better at that. So another thing that I stumbled into quite by accident was, we sometimes get a boring winter here in Madison where it doesn't snow and it's not cold enough for me. And that's my favorite season. So one of those seasons, I said, I've got to get past this parochial view of the winter. I have to get a sort of a hemispheric view of this. And I started tracing the areal extent of -5 degrees Celsius air at 850 millibars, about 23 Fahrenheit. And why -5? Well, because -5 is the rain snow line, confident rain snow line in a storm if such a thing comes by you. So I had that in the back of my mind. So I thought, if I can calculate the areal extent of this every 6 hours from the NCEP reanalysis or the JRA reanalysis, whatever it might be, and then see how it expands and contracts during the winter, that'd be interesting in and of itself. But then I went back all the way to the beginning of the NCEP reanalysis, 1948-49 winter, all the way to the last winter, 2021. And there's a systematic decrease in the seasonal average cold air at 850 millibars. And that, to me, is a free atmosphere signal of the fact the planet's warming up slightly. And there's no real way to refute that. That's what's thrilling to me and I'm not a climate guy. That's not what I got into the science for. But you stumble into these things by asking questions about what you see in the observations. You can't create cold air except by, you can't shrink the area of cold air except by warming it on the edges. And the only way you can do that systematically is to change the composition of the atmosphere and the radiative balance. And so we got this global warming signal in the wintertime data. And most of the time, people are screaming and yelling about heat waves and wildfires. But the fact is, there's global warming that you can detect at any time of year. And that was a thrill to me. So I've had some fun playing around with that, trying to see what other kinds of things I can squeeze out of the long-term time series in the wintertime. So I've had fun with these things.
Hey, Bill, we got to get Dr. Martin more interested in the southeast sector of these mid-latitude cyclones. I mean, he's all about the northwest quadrant. What about the southeast quadrant? Come on, man.
It's so funny you say that, James, because if you read my PhD thesis, and I recommend it only if you can't sleep, but if you ever read it, you'll find every single one of the squall lines that we look at, because we're looking at these frontal structures in the middle troposphere that spawn, precipitation lines that are out in the middle of the warm sector. So they're all the southeast sector of these storms. So I started out there, but I came back to my paper route, which is the northwest quadrant.
Yeah, I thought I remember a reference somewhere in one of your writings or someone's writings about the stuff you were working on, that nothing happens in the warm sector. And I thought that we live and die by what happens in the warm sector.
Yeah, that's exactly, especially down there. You guys get freight trains leaving their tracks in the warm sector in March and February. I'm well aware of that. I love that stuff.
We are the warm sector.
You see these mid-level chronogenetically active baroclinic zones that are somehow cut off on the bottom part of the troposphere by the Rocky Mountains, and that's what's driving some of them. It's thrilling.
So while we're on this subject, I'm just a practitioner. All right, I forecast the weather. What can we do? Because listen, you know more about mid-latitude cyclones than anybody else on the planet. What can we do to improve the communication between researchers and practitioners? What can we do to work on this communications gap we've always had?
That is a great question. I have a suspicion, James, maybe I'm wrong. I'm going to say it anyway. My suspicion is that both sides get their gander up a little bit when they talk to each other. Now, the academics want to show off, and the operational side wants to say, don't show off. And I think if we could, I work with math colleagues across the department on some problems. I don't know what the hell they're talking about half the time. I honestly don't. But I'm there as the guardrail because they're trying to say something about weather systems. And so I'll tell them when I can finally translate what they're saying. Well, wait a minute. Now you said something about that aspect of this weather system. It's probably not right. We got to rethink about that. So what I've done with, these are great colleagues of mine. I love working with them because what we agreed to 5 or 6 years ago when we started the collaboration was let's leave our egos at the door. You know that I know more about weather systems than you do. I know that you know more about mathematics than I do. Let's go into it with that. And if we want to improve the conversation between operational and academic meteorologists, and then practitioners who are outside perhaps of what the operational community might even think. They might think weather service people might not think much about people who are broadcast meteorologists. They shouldn't do that. They shouldn't have that bias. And so we all need to say, look, let's talk about snowstorms today. Here's what I can bring to the table. I can't wait. And I honestly say this to my colleagues at the Milwaukee office. I can't wait for you to tell me something that I just said is wrong, because that's going to give me, I'm starved for ideas. I have to come back here and help a young student get a decent thesis project. And if they're relying on me to come up with the idea, I'm going to run out of them. So I need to talk to people who are going to say, no, you're wrong about that. We see this instead over and over and over. Go and study that. Thank you. I will go and do that. And they'll come back and tell you, and then we'll have the same kind of interaction again. So from my perspective, I like to go into any conversation I have with anybody in our field, saying, here's what I know, and tell me now what you know. And then let's see where there's intersection and where there isn't. And then let's figure out a strategy for how we can learn about the stuff that doesn't intersect.
One of the things we do here, we have a collaboration chat with the National Weather Service meteorologist and broadcast meteorologist prior to big events.
Yeah.
This would be prior to a winter storm, prior to a flood event, prior to a hurricane, a tornado outbreak, whatever. And I just sometimes wonder, do we need to invite somebody from the academic community like you to come into that chat to throw out ideas? The simple reason we do that is to exchange ideas.
Yeah.
So we can be somewhat on the same page as we all communicate with the masses. And I think it would be a marvelous thing to get somebody from the academic world, the research side, to come in, because they might have a trinket of knowledge that really helps us in an urgent weather situation like that. Do you think that most academics would be willing to participate in something like that?
I would be. And I can tell you honestly, I'd come into that doing almost nothing but listening. You know why? Because I'm a terrible forecaster, and I know that. I don't have any skill at it. I don't have the patience to stick with it. But when we get onto an issue, and I have to say, especially a snowstorm issue, I'm like a dog with a bone in my mouth. I can't let it go. I mean, I really get riveted onto that. So that's how I would approach it. I don't know if you're familiar with Dr. Greg Postel at the Weather Channel.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. He is a great friend of mine. We've been friends for years. He came to Wisconsin as a graduate student. He's a great example of exactly what you're talking about. There's a person with impeccable academic credentials, but he has great communication skills. He listens well, and he pays attention to other people's insights. And so whenever we talk, all he's doing is asking me questions. And I love that about the interactions I have with him. And so that's the way I model my interactions with everybody in my field over the way he and I interact, as a matter of fact, because that's how I think it would work.
I think we might open up that idea because I hear the same thing. People say the same thing you do. I suck at weather forecasting. And these are brilliant academics. And so what?
Yeah.
I mean, you can bring so many ideas to the table that we don't think of in this situation. You look at it differently than we do. So I think I would love for that to happen. But let's shift
don't forget,
over,
James, the research to operations nexus that Greg Stumpf and that amazing group of about 25, 30 people have done at the last few NWA meetings. They even took it over to the AMS, and it will be a part of the meeting in Tulsa. I think, we've been a part of it on this show for the last few years, sitting in and, seeing some of that in action. So, that's a real place that you can get involved in that at the NWA and the AMS level.
And that brings to mind, so many of us just believe that if you're an operational guy, you go to NWA. If you're an academic, you go to the AMS. Do you see that? Do you feel that, Dr. Martin, the same kind of thing?
Yeah. There's no question that's true, James. And in fact, it was true in the 1960s. Sutcliffe makes a big comment about that. And I found it in one of his commentaries in one of the WMO magazines, the idea that British meteorology was being split into atmospheric physics and weather and something else. And he said, what are we doing here? We're all talking about the same atmosphere. We should be listening to each other, not dividing ourselves into all these different meetings just because we feel more comfortable with this or that population. I'm a big believer in forcing everybody to, I don't know how you force people to be comfortable, but speaking out in a room if somebody misbehaves. If you're at an AMS meeting as an operational meteorologist, and some academic stands up and says, you guys are all wrong, blah, 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 and just shows no respect at all, that person should be hammered personally for that, socially. Somebody should stand up and say, we don't do that here. If I'm the meeting coordinator at that meeting, that's what I do. That's what I'd say. I say, you can't talk like that in this meeting. That's not how we're going to treat each other. We're going to have respectful questioning, and you can do whatever you need outside in the hallway. I think if we did that, people would be a lot less afraid to come to these meetings and cross over. I'm not afraid to go to NWA meetings. I've just never been invited. So I guess I'm victim of the very thing that I'm complaining about, but I have to try and work around that.
I'll invite this man.
Tulsa.
Bill is like one of the big shots of the NWA. He's the grand poobah. What's your title with that, Bill?
I'm retired now, James. I'm just a card-carrying member now.
Well, once you're the grand poobah, you're always the grand poobah. So there's your official invitation.
Nate's the grand poobah.
So Dr. Martin, let's talk about NWP. Where do we go from here? Where are we going in 5 years, 10 years of models?
I don't know. The rumor that I hear, and it's not my field, so I don't really know, but the rumor I hear is that machine learning is going to be the new thing. We're going to just throw 8 million ensemble members at a machine, and it's going to tell us something about how to make sense of the weather. I'm open to the fact that there'll be great insights gained by mining these things. I think the models are so good today that when you run an ensemble with almost not even infinitesimally varying initial conditions, you're going to get a nice picture of the broad possibilities that exist out there for the next 24, 48, or 5 days. Whether or not machine learning is going to be the way for us to really take advantage of that is a question I have. And the reason why is because it's a statistical project in its essence. That's all it is statistical. And I'm afraid that here's the thing I'm afraid of, James, is a push in the AMS, I think, back channels maybe, for us to change our curriculum and instruct young meteorologists at the bachelor's level degree, make sure they take several machine learning courses and that they take all of these other courses to understand how to interpret the output from these huge ensembles. And I'm afraid that what that's going to do is going to leave us with a group of people who know nothing about the backbone of theory that drives the weather, but they know something about how to interpret the current set of tools that give us insight about the next 2 days. But that's unsatisfying to me. What are you? Then you're kind of driving a bus only. You're not really a mechanic on it. You're not learning how it works. So I'm afraid of that. I hope I'm wrong about that, but I think that the increased resolution and the increased computing power is moving us in that direction. We're getting to the point where the horizontal resolution of the models can't get much smaller with the current observational network. And so the only other place to go is statistical post-processing, and that's machine learning. So I don't really look at that with great hope.
So upper air data, where do we stay? We got the radiosondes, satellite data, aircraft data. What can we do to improve real-time upper air data in coming years and decades? Rick Anthes has been a big proponent for a number of years on radio occultation. So you have a bunch of satellites surrounding the Earth, and they're shooting, some sort of electromagnetic radiation through the atmosphere, and the path that they take depends on the temperature and density structure and so on. And if you have an array of them around your atmosphere, you can get really highly resolved profiles of temperature and humidity. And so he has shown examples at conferences and at individual talks. We've had him here at Wisconsin, where you end up with what's effectively a tenfold increase in the radiosonde network over the United States from these radio occultation opportunities. And then and Rick, of course, made his living running numerical models. He built the MM suite of models, the MM4 and 5. MM1, it was his first one. And so then he runs all of those with this highly resolved set of observations, and you get completely, fantastic forecasts. And then I feel more confident that driving the resolution down to the model suites is better then, because you've got such a much more highly resolved set of observations. So that might be one way. I don't know if it's the only way, but it might be the cheapest way too, because we have so much satellite already out at space. One of my colleagues, Tristan Lecuyer, is running, what do they call them? They're these little boxes about the size of a MacBook Pro in square, cube satellites. And they have incredible remote sensing capabilities. You can see down to the particle size distribution in clouds on some of these things. They're cheap, and you can put them out there and they last, a good long time, and you can have a whole array of them. So that might be where we go next with upper air obs is getting, great confidence in the vast array, increasing array of smaller cube-like satellites that take some of those observations.
Yeah,
Bill, what episode
3 weeks
was
ago,
that?
we had Chris Manchek on from Spire, Dr. Martin, and he talked at length about it. And James, I love something JP's doing in the notes. He's putting time frames in there, like, what is radio occultation? You can see it at 4 minutes in. Availability of proprietary data for RO at 1350, the history of Spire at 3450. Kudos to JP for putting those notes in there. That's really good.
Yeah, that was a very interesting show. Dr. Martin, and I know we're running out of time here, but I've got to ask, based on your position at the university there, advice for younger people. Let's say there's a high school senior that's listening to this. They're coming into high school. They're a senior. They are in love with weather, and they're pretty good with math. They're pretty good with physics. And give some advice for young people that want to be somewhere. They don't know if it's research. They don't know. What's some good advice for them?
Well, I guess maybe a primary thing I'd say, because it's available in this area, it wasn't available to us when we were in that same situation many years ago. Get in contact with some of these people who work in the field. You can look up people's email addresses. You can look up universities that have programs in meteorology. You can probably make a phone call to a program director, or you can make a phone call or an email contact with a professor and just say, hey, I'm a junior. I'm in Marietta, Georgia. I'm interested in severe storms in the summer. What can you tell me about that? Where should I go to school? Who might I talk to? Things like that. I mean, all of us has our own little Rolodex. There's probably a lot of overlap within those Rolodexes, but no matter where you start, you're better off than you were to begin with. And I think that's one way that you can do that. The other is, don't fall victim to the notion that, the mathematics you're learning in your second calculus course in high school is, quote, never going to be used. That's total BS. You're going to find an application for it somewhere. And I can tell you that if you slave yourself through it, it will pay off in spades, because it'll either be in the field that you think you like right now, which I hope it is, meteorology. It's something that gets a grip on you and doesn't let go. But there may be other places that you decide to go once you're in college and kind of exploring other interests. And your math skills will give you a ticket to a lot of exciting places and a lot of opportunities when you're all done with college. So don't give up on that. And in fact, find ways to enhance it. Play with numbers, play with ideas. And also don't neglect writing. Learn how to write, learn how to speak, but especially learn how to write, because you can always read something if you have to speak, but you got to write it first. So you got to learn how to do that. So those would be things that I'd say would be good things to think about as a young person. And don't let anyone talk you out of it. The weather is not a dead subject. And it's not true that we get paid for being wrong 50% of the time. The fact is we're right about 95% of the time. Otis Nixon was right about 30% of the time, and he made a good living. Right? So
yeah, really good living. So this is your chance to plug the University of Wisconsin, Madison. Describe the program there. The strengths. What can kids expect if they come in?
I appreciate this chance because I will say, of all the places that I've been lucky to go, and all of them were good, but the University of Wisconsin has the broadest group of scholars of any place I've ever been. We have people who are studying the climate system with respect to the atmosphere, with respect to the ocean, and the way that one can interrogate it with satellite observations. We're the world headquarters for satellite meteorology. It was invented here, and there's no place better for it. We have a tremendous tradition and a great group of scholars working on weather systems at all scales: mesoscale, synoptic scale, and global general circulation scale. And we've got people who are working on the polar meteorology problems as well, of the polar ocean, the polar atmosphere, and then tropical meteorology. We've got that covered. So there's almost no branch of our science that we don't have an active scholar. And our department is a very functional place. When I first came here from Washington, I don't have bad things to say about Washington, with one exception. It's quite a hierarchical place that when you're an undergrad there, you're an undergrad. You're on the bottom of the totem pole. When you're a master's degree graduate student, you're below the PhD graduate students. And when you're a graduate student of any kind, you're well below the professors, no matter how far along you are in your degree. That's not true here at Wisconsin. I can promise you that. My goal as a graduate mentor and as an undergraduate mentor is to try and convince people that they are a player in the field as soon as it's true. Once they demonstrate it to me with a good weather discussion as an undergrad, with a decent discussion at our dynamics seminar as a graduate student, I tell them, you are now the world expert on your subject, and you have to start acting like it. And you have to be confident of that you're that person. I never got that at Washington. So that's something that I think really matters here. And the final thing, we're on a giant campus, 48,000 people. It's an exciting place to be. Sometimes people are intimidated by that size. The great thing about it is we'll give you a key to our building the day you arrive on campus. You can be part of a small, intimate program. You will be best friends with the people with whom you are arrayed against a common enemy, which is the faculty in your junior and senior years. And you will spend a lot of time in this building, but you'll develop friendships that'll last a lifetime in the context of a small, intimate program on a giant campus. There's no better situation than that. Because if you want to get away from your dynamics nerd friends, you can go to the football game. And if you want to get away from those crowds, you can come back to your dynamics nerd friends. So it's great.
And I did that a couple of years ago when the NWA was in Madison. I walked that. I went in on Friday night so I could go to the, to Camp Randall.
Yeah.
And walk to the stadium from the Hilton downtown, which, sounds like a crazy thing to do. But there are all these incredible restaurants in Madison, Nepalese food. I had like 5 or 6 different cuisines on my way over and back from the football game.
When you have 60 days a year where the temperature doesn't get above 35, you better do something indoors. You better like doing things indoors. So that's one reason why we have a plethora of nice restaurants, I think. But the weather here,
what year was that NWA, Bill?
It was the year after ours. It was 2012.
Because as I remember, Madison was a very clean place. To my knowledge, I didn't encounter any jerks. The people were nice.
Yeah.
And I felt very, very comfortable there.
Me too.
So that's another aspect that's worth highlighting. It is it's a unique place in the sense that it's the seat of the state government, the seat of the flagship university. So it's a very cosmopolitan town for its size. We get great music acts, great theater acts coming through town, and like you'd get at a much bigger city, but it has the feel of a small town at the same time, which is great.
So before we take a break here, Dr. Martin, Brewers or Red Sox, who you pull for?
I'm a Brewers fan now. I'm still a Red Sox fan, but I'll tell you the truth, James, I don't know who's in their lineup. I don't know anymore. When I was a kid, every year it was Dwight Evans, Kyle Yastrzemski, Jim Rice. They were all coming back every year. I don't know who's on the team now. I love Rafael Devers. I like Bogarts. but I don't know them as well as I know the Brewers. I just think the Brewers are great. They're like they're the Tampa Bay Rays of the National League. They're a great team.
Well, we enjoyed watching them Saturday in Atlanta, and
I
I'm a
bet
Red
you
Sox.
did.
I'm a Red Sox guy. I've
Are
been
you?
to Fenway every year since 2010. Although last year we didn't go because of COVID,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
we were up there for a Yankee series about a month ago and just had a great time.
Oh, I
It's an
envy you.
amazing place. I love Boston, but we're going to come to Milwaukee. We have to see a game up there.
Yeah,
Uh,
make sure you
I
let
haven't
me
done
know.
that stadium either. Yeah, that's one I got.
It's
I
a-
did the old stadium, but I haven't done the new stadium.
Yeah,
the
County-
stadium, the stadium looks really nice.
It's a great place to watch a game. But there was something really special about County Stadium. I'm glad that they've got a nice new stadium because my son and I go 10 times a year or so, and so we love it. But boys, going there and seeing a place where Hank Aaron played and Eddie
Exactly.
Matthews and all those guys, it's special. So
Yep. All right. Well, we have to take a break here. Dr. Martin will give you fair warning. If you can stick around, we're going to be asking you for a pick of the week. This is some website or something that is weather related here coming up in a couple of minutes, but we must pause.
Okay.
We're going to hear from Tony Rice in the Astronomy Report. We're going to hear from Jen this week in tornado history. We'll come back with the weather roundup. We'll talk about weather across North America and the globe. We've got the picks of the week. The email inbox returns this week and much more as WeatherBrains rolls along.
Looking beyond the atmosphere, here's Tony Rice with your astronomy outlook.
Picture the solar system like a bullseye. In the center, you've got the sun, surrounded by rings that the planets orbit around. Each planet makes its way around at its own pace. The inner ones, like Mercury and Venus, they take a lot less time than the outer ones, like Jupiter and Saturn. Usually the sun's off to one side, but every so often things line up with the planet, the sun, and Earth all in a line. Depending on the ordering of that line, this is called either a conjunction or an opposition. And this is happening 3 times in August. Yesterday, August 1st, Mercury was in solar conjunction. That meant that the line went Mercury, then the sun, then the Earth. That also meant that Mercury was behind the sun and lost in its glare, where it'll stay for the next several weeks. But towards the end of the month, Mercury's orbit will bring it very close, about 1/10 of a degree away from Mars, low on the evening horizon. Tonight, August 2nd, Saturn is at solar opposition, or Saturn is opposite the sun in our sky. The line is made up of the sun, then Earth, then Saturn. This is when the planets are at their closest and brightest, and it's going to remain pretty bright for the next several weeks. Look after sunset in the southwest. When you go outside and look, you might spot closer and even brighter Jupiter, a bit down and to the left of Saturn. That gas giant is going to continue to grow brighter and closer until its solar opposition on Friday, August 20th. That's your Astronomy Outlook. Follow me at RTP Hokie for more spacey stuff like this.
This week in tornado history, 4 tornadoes are found in the Storm Prediction Center database for August 7th, 2003. 2 were in Palm Beach County, Florida, one of which was given a high EF1 rating. The National Weather Service in Miami, in their summary, described this event as unusual for August to see such a strong tornado form in South Florida. Quote, the tornadoes apparently occurred with back-building thunderstorms developing along a sea breeze convergence line, reinforced by thunderstorm outflow boundaries from the southwest and the west. The tornadoes also occurred in a very low shear environment, which is unusual because it's harder to get strong tornadoes without shear in this environment. Therefore, in order to produce a tornado in such an environment, everything must come together just right, including some interaction with a boundary of some kind. The summary also stated that some of the damage was very close to being classified F2. They estimated, though, that max winds were near 100 miles per hour. That's in the upper F1 range. This upper F1 damage was found at Garden Walk Mobile Home Park. A total of 58 homes were destroyed, several cars and trucks were overturned, and there were 28 minor injuries. We detail this event on our website at tornadotalk.com.
Okay, I don't see Aubrey yet. We'll hold off on email until she comes back. So let's do a quick weather roundup. We're doing the show here on the 2nd of August. And Jen, what happened on this date in 1985? Just random question. Do you happen to remember? It was an aviation incident involving weather in Texas.
Dallas. In Dallas.
Yes.
It was the winds. I can't remember exactly all the details of that though.
Yeah, every time I see August the 2nd, immediately it comes back to working that Friday. It was a Friday evening, hot day in August, and I was off the next week, and I was going to be leaving early the next morning to come back to Alabama. And during our 6 o'clock news, and understand, this was 1985, so we didn't have Facebook and Twitter and the gram and everything. So I had my ham radio gear with me. I was tuned into 146.88, the Dallas County, Racy's channel, and started hearing a lot of traffic coming from the airport, a lot, and it didn't sound good. And so this was during the 6 o'clock news, about 6:08, 6:09, 6:10, before the weather segment. So I darted back over to the assignment desk, and I could tell there was something going on. And I did the weather, and we had a big storm between Dallas and Fort Worth. A summer storm. It wasn't severe by classic definition. We didn't have large hail. We didn't have damaging winds at the surface, but there was a good core. And anyway, when I got off the weather, that's when they broke in with the news that there was a major passenger jet crash at DFW Airport. It was Delta Flight 191. I want to say it originated at Fort Lauderdale, and it came down out there near the north end of the property, and the pilot flew into the thunderstorm, and wind shear got it. And it was a horrible situation. There was some deaths on the ground. I want to say maybe a dozen people survived, but everybody else died. And I wound up having to stay in Dallas to work with the National Transportation Safety Board guys, their GO team, because at the time we had a Doppler radar. Now, understand, this was a very, compared to the next rad we have today, this was very primitive, but yet it did have some velocity data. And so I had to stay back for a couple of days and work with them. But that was just a horrible tragedy. But I'll say this, and we got to move on. I'll never forget watching WFAA that night. Now, this is kind of weird because I work for KDFW Channel 4 in Dallas, a CBS affiliate, but I was watching our competition, WFAA Channel 8. The work they did that night during that event was stunning. They went on the air and they stayed on the air. And that was very bold in 1985. They didn't go back to regular programming. They stayed on the air for probably 8 hours with that story. And to this day, that blood is running through my veins of everything they did. It was stunning how good they were. The reporters knew the territory. They were calm. They were good communicators. They didn't get emotionally attached to the story. And the information was so good. And when I do long form severe weather coverage, a lot of what you see in me originated from that night, August 2nd, 1985. So it's just odd that I see that date and I just flash back to that. So anyway, that was a horrible weather related aviation thing. And of course, everything changed after that. Everything changed in terms of, procedure, in terms of communication with the pilots, in terms of the radar systems they have on board. Everything's different now. We learned a lot. Dr. Fujita studied that one. Bill, didn't he come in and do some work on that?
That's a good
I want to
question.
say,
I'm not sure. The Fujita American Experience is on my DVR again. We had the filmmaker on, was it last year or 2 years ago? They all run together now after I've been doing this so long, but that was fascinating. So I've got to go back and watch that again. James, it's hard to imagine that from that day in 1985, it would only be 9 years before the last, U.S. crash of a major passenger liner due to wind shear. So, that problem got solved, and the next solved. It could still happen at any moment, I guess. But, at least we've been very fortunate since 1994. James, you remember on July 10th, 1991, we had a commuter airliner, L Express, that crashed out here in the western part of Birmingham on July 10th, 1991, which was heartbreaking too.
Yeah, same kind of thing. But I looked, and that was an old L-1011 that crashed out there. And so many good things have come about as of that horrible tragedy. And you're right. I mean, I don't even think twice about flying. I know that no pilot's going to fly into a thunderstorm like that. They know. We all know better. So anyway, I don't see Aubrey. So if we don't see Aubrey come back in a second, we will let you answer one of the questions, Bill, in just a second. But let's do a quick weather roundup. We've talked about, Jen, you are dry and cool.
Yeah. I'm loving it. In the 70s, the past couple of days, lows in the 50s, great sleeping weather. And then we warm up again mid to late week, where I think we get back to close to 90 up here by the weekend. Not a lot of rain though, so we're kind of running short here, and things are starting to look a little crispy. So I'll be glad to see some rain return, but not in the cards anytime soon, and just pretty quiet up here in the Ohio Valley.
Dr. Martin, what you got up in Madison?
We got it just like Jen. We got a postcard day today, James. Up 75 for a high, dew point about 50. It's been a wild summer. We've had some streaks of really high humidity, but absolutely gorgeous today, almost autumnal. But just like Jen, we're going to get ourselves back to about 90. Although I think the dew points will be in the low 60s. They'll be better behaved than they have been lately. We're running 10 inches below normal from last August 1st to now in precipitation, and 7 of those 10 inches have been a deficit since April 1st. So we're really struggling in the southern part of the state. In fact, I think Kenosha County is under severe drought, and much of us are under moderate drought right now. So it's this picture postcard weather has its negative side, which is the dryness. We don't have any rain coming either, Jen, for at least 7-8 days. And that's probably a guess about the 8 days. You hope for something, but probably won't be anything.
Mm-hmm.
Of course,
Bill
Murray
Bill
Murray has a flash flood a week at his house. So
yeah,
I tell you what, we just cleared all the trees that came crashing down the hillside in the event a couple of days ago, and I have to admit, my stomach was in my throat when we were driving home Saturday, James. When I saw that big severe thunderstorm rolling into Birmingham, I was like, not again. Yeah, but fortunately, we only got 0.6 of an inch out of that one, and wasn't too terrible. But anytime I see my Tempest weather station putting extreme rainfall rates up for more than about 2 or 3 minutes, I get a little nervous these days.
Okay, well, I don't see Jen here, but whatever. I think Bill might have one answer to one email. Wait, I meant Aubrey. What am I thinking here? I've been
what you meant.
Yeah,
I'm just thinking.
Aubrey is
got to retrain him after vacation.
Got to reprogram my whole brain here.
We get letters. We get stacks and stacks of letters.
All right, Bill, take it.
Yeah, Tyler Harris wrote and said, question, hey, what are the WeatherBrains episodes that centered around the 1974 super outbreak? I'd love to listen to the ones you mentioned on last week's podcast. And so, Tyler, it wasn't easy, but I went back and did some very rewarding research, and I've made these 4 things my pick of the week. The definitive show is show 114. Fabulous discussion with Alan Pearson, the legendary Alan Pearson of National Severe Storms Forecast Center fame, Bob Ferry, who was the MIC at Birmingham for the outbreak, Jay Shelley, who was J.B. Elliott's immediate supervisor for most of the time he was in the Weather Service, and of course our J.B. James, I miss J.B. so bad. You listen to a show like that, you really realize how much. But that is the definitive show, and I've got a link for that. There is another good discussion about the event in show 62. Got a link for that. And there's another show where JB talks about the event in show 110. So I've got that link. But in show number 10, James, that's hard to believe when we're sitting here at 8:11. We actually read a lot of the warnings from that night. And going back to listen to that just sort of gives you a little a chill up and down your spine, because of course it was a very different ball game back then, how warnings were done. But that show will give you a little taste of that.
Okay, and we'll get Aubrey back next week. And again, for those that don't know, some of us have real jobs. We're like working the night shift, and they pay us to be doing other things. And sometimes we have to go do other things. So she is.
You can't make enough money here, James.
Well, that big check comes in, I might just retire from TV. So really quick, let's do picks of the week, and I'm gonna have to do mine and go to Studio A. But my pick involves a tool developed at the University of Wisconsin.
Hey.
Do you know John Centennial by any chance?
I probably do, but not by name.
He is with the Cooperative Institute for Meteorological Satellite Studies, CIMSS.
Yeah.
And he's developed a product called ProbSevere, a statistical model that predicts the probability that a storm will produce severe weather in the near term. It predicts lightning. and it uses what we've talked about, machine learning.
Yeah.
With data, and so it's a fascinating product, and I've really not used it in an operational way yet here. But have you seen this at all, Dr. Martin? Have you seen this product?
I think I've seen iterations of it. So they use things like brightness, temperature of the overshooting tops and stuff like that, and so on, and iteration of it. But I definitely know that such a thing has been developed downstairs in the building, and they do some really great work with how to talk about how to squeeze information out of data. They are geniuses of it down at Sims.
It's amazing. I mean, you get probability of lightning, you get probability of intense convection, and some other products here, and it's really interesting. And again, this is what we need down here on this level. So I think it's a very interesting product, and we'll put a link to the product and the site up on the website, weatherbrains.com. All of the picks of the week will be there. So, Bill, I'm going to turn the floor over to you, and I've got to go to Studio A and put on the TV duds here.
That means we have the keys to the car till 10:35 Central when James gets back. So this could be dangerous, James.
Yeah. Go for it.
I don't know.
Well, we'll continue with the theme of picks of the week here. Jen Nairmore, I know you got a great pick of the week for us.
I do. Yeah, I got something from Twitter. It is a video of a tornado today in Russia. Looks like it was pretty intense, and you can see the debris flying around here, but that's a rarity there. But yeah, that came across the tweeter today. So you'll see that link today on the website.
Yeah, they probably just censor all the information about tornadoes. They don't want us to know that they have such bad things in Russia. Could be what's going on there. You never know. Got to watch out. We'll get our website. We'll have a ransomware on it here shortly. And you can just have it. We don't even care. We'll just make a new one, right, Jen? Dr. Martin, I know you got a pick of the week. I saw you working on it on the computer back there. Did you come up with something cool for us?
Well, I think I did. It's a program that we've had at Wisconsin for a long time, and I don't know how well known it is. It's called Viz5D. The Weather Service, I think, has put it into AWIPS in one way or another. But Viz5D is freely available, and I think you'd have to Google Viz5D, BIS, and then 5D. But it's freely available. Greg Tripoli converts the GFS model data into Viz5D format every day. So that's on our Wisconsin webpage if you search around for that. And it's a 4-dimensional rendering program. So at any instant, you can see a 3D picture of the whole atmosphere, make surfaces of various variables and so on, make clouds in it and so on from the numerical forecast data. And then you can run them forward in time. That's the 4th dimension. And so it's fantastically insightful in terms of the structure and development of weather systems. And there are a whole bunch of different data sets out there, I think, that one could probably find, and this is where I don't know for sure, but severe thunderstorm data sets and so on, where you can actually see the air moving through severe convective storms and as well as winter storms. So it's a great program. So I would highly recommend those geeks out there who are interested in looking at really fascinating displays of data, look for Viz5D. It's apparently easy to download onto just about any machine. And then there's access to data sets that you can use the program on to animate them. It's fantastic. It'll change your life. So be prepared that if you've never seen it before,
life-changing pick of the week. I love it.
Yes, cool. It will change your life.
Yeah.
I knew you'd be good for a good one, but I had no idea it would be that over the top, Dr. Martin. That's a perfect pick of the week. Jen, what else do we need to talk about tonight while we've got the good doctor here?
I'd like to know how to get your book.
Oh, thank you for asking.
You bet.
There's a couple of different ways to do it. I guess you can get it on the internet, but my daughter would kill me. She works at a bookstore here in town. She's their special
good for her.
manager. It's a bookstore called Mystery to Me on Monroe Street in Madison. If you so desire, and you order it through them, they will call me up and I'll sign it for you personally. And, and they'll take your name too. So whoever you are, you say, I'm Jim Anderson, I'll write you a note. So that's a cool way to do it.
What was the name of the bookstore, Dr. Martin?
Mystery to Me. And let me get the address for you quickly.
Well, we'll find that because I had to download it from my Kindle.
Yeah,
so
you can
have
find
it right away. But
you can probably find it on the internet easily. But Mystery to Me, just 3 English words, and it's on Monroe Street in Madison. So So that's one way to get it. And you get it at the same price. You don't pay anything extra for getting it through them. It's just that you don't pay Jeff Bezos to go to the moon or wherever he's going to go next, that way. So and there's a lot of people who think that's a good idea. So this bookseller pays taxes. So there's a little incentive to do it.
Well, I've got a room full of books back here, and they're real books. And this does in a pinch, but that's where the real books are back there.
But it is everywhere on the internet. Purdue's been really good about advertising it widely. So there's a lot of different places you can get it. But if you do get it from Mystery to Me, I'll sign it personally, and I'd be happy to do that.
Well, I think you can count on 2 customers coming through there very shortly. So be on the watch for that. And it won't be the Caddyshack guy when you see the one from Bill Murray. This has been a real pleasure and a thrill, Dr. Martin. I knew getting into the book, that it would be a good read, but I had no idea. And it made for one of those fun summer reads you probably won't see on the old Better Life and House and Gardens summer reading list, but definitely find it on my.
Bill, thank you so much for your kind comments about it. It really does make me happy.
Well, we can't wait to see you next one. And you wrote a couple of textbooks along the way too, didn't you?
Yeah. I have a textbook on mid-latitude atmospheric dynamics that I did with Wiley in 2006, and so I'm happy about that. It came out the way that I wanted it to, and people seem to like it. So, and it's cheap for what you get. It's 2 semesters of learning for $50 or whatever it is, I guess. So I'm glad about that.
Well, we'd love to have you back anytime. Please come back.
Well, thanks. I'd be thrilled to come back. It would be really fun. If we get a good winter storm either down there or up here, let's talk about it. That'd be really fun.
Yeah, we'll yell at you.
Great.
And, next time we're in Madison, we'll come look you up.
Yeah,
too.
Please do. My door's always open. Let's go to lunch or something if you guys are in town. That'd be great.
That would be a blast. Well, seeing no other business to bring before the big digital mahogany table here, I'll go ahead and sign us off. WeatherBrains is the weekly netcast. It's all about weather. We do this on Monday nights usually at 8:00. Have great guests like Dr. Jonathan Martin on each week. Next week we don't have a guest yet, so I got to get to work on that. But Storm Chaser Parker Cops will join us on the 16th. That's going to be a fun show. 23rd show, we may have to move around a little bit because it's going to be the beginning of NWA. And I think we'll be working with the folks at Ron. So we're going to talk to those guests. We'll probably shift that show a week and work on that. But that's all the machinations you don't have to worry about here behind the scenes in the old guest booking officer office. But until next Monday night, when we will see you right here the same time, same place. I'm guest booking officer Bill Murray telling you to have a great week and keep an eye to the sky because you'll always have something fun to look at. Bye, Jen.
Bye, guys.
Bye, Dr.
Wonderful
Martin.
to meet you. Thank you, sir, for being a part of the show.
Yeah, great fun.
Thanks
Y'all have a good week.
Yeah, I'm back. All right. Great having Dr. Martin on the show this week. A very interesting discussion and good show. Glad to be back on Monday night. Again, my next vacation week is Christmas, so we'll be here for a while in our regular time. So we'll see you guys next Monday.